So let's look at an example of using this PyTest to do some testing. We're going to do it with the Uni App example. And if you remember, the Uni App has a bunch of users. So there's students, staff, there's admin, and there's guest users. And it's probably the simplest one to work with because we're not testing it, broadcasting its messages. What we're doing is testing all those different classes. So we're testing the person, the user, the staff, and the student, and to see what they do. Now, it's the simplest one because none of those classes have any methods. They just store data. So if we go back to, let's just look at the example code. Here's the Uni App. So we're not going to test the database. There's the database where we create all the staff. We're not going to test the app. There's the app where we figure out which messages to send and who gets them, and do that in a GUI. We're not going to test any of that. We're going to test these individual classes like the person. It's a very simple class because it's only doing one thing. It's storing a name. That's all it does. It just stores a bit of data, the name of the person. Or the user stores the name and the user ID. So all we have to do when we want to test these is check that when we create one of these things, it stores the information that we want it to. It's almost, it's almost kind of too trivial to test, but that's what we're going to do as an initial example. And that's what you would normally do. You put in these tests all the time just to make sure that nothing's happening to the data. Okay, so we're just checking that a variable has been set correctly inside an object. So what we'll do is, in the first version of this, we're going to write some separate test files for each class. So we'll do examples for the user and the student classes, but the other two, the person and the staff, will be similar. And here's the one for the user. Okay, so remember, I've just shown you the user. It stores the user's name and it stores the ID. So in order to test it, we just got to check that those variables are set correctly. So what do? We create a dummy user object. It doesn't have to match any of the ones in our actual code. It doesn't have to be a real user. It just has to store some information, and we have to check that that information then is stored correctly. So we create this dummy user object there, and then we use assert statements to check that it has stored the name, which is dummy name, in its name variable, and it's stored the user ID, which is ID001, in its user ID variable. So we just use assert statements to check those things are true. So check that user.name equals dummy name and user.id is ID001, which are things we've just passed to it, right? So we're just checking that the object has been given those things and nothing untoward has happened inside. It hasn't stored them in the wrong way. Then we want to tell ourselves that it's passed the test, assuming those things are true. So we print something out, but with the captured system, the captured output disabled. So we don't want this to be captured, and we print out confirmation. We tested user._class.name successfully, and that's all we need to do for testing this very basic class. Okay. Note that thing we've got there, the object, the _class._name, just records the name of the object's class, which in this case is a user. Okay, so this, when I print this out, it's going to say tested user successfully. So let's run that. Okay, there's my user 05, and there's my user 05 test, which is the code I've just shown you. And what I can do is run PyTest in this file. Okay, run PyTest, and what that will do, it will look for all the functions that start with test underscore or end with test underscore. So it'll just look for this function, and it'll run it. Okay, so if I run that, there's the output. Takes a while to get through to PyTest, but then you can see there's the output. It says tested. So here it's telling me what function it's running. It's running this file user05 test, and it's running the test user function. So, but there's the output I've given it. It's printing out tested user successfully. Okay, and if something had gone wrong, suppose, for example, the another programmer had come along and decided, actually, no, it'd be a good idea to store all these names in lowercase. Oops, no, other way around. So suppose, put it there. There we go. That's what I meant. So suppose somebody's come along, they've changed our class, and they've changed it so that it now takes the name that's passed in, which, you know, in our test is dummy name, and it turns it into lowercase and then stores that. So the class is still, you know, still functioning, but now it's only storing lowercase names. When we run this test, okay, I can also, as well as right-clicking on the file, I can also click on this arrow and run PyTest. When I run it this time, I should get an error because now the username won't be dummy name uppercase, that is, it'll be dummy name lowercase. And you can see, as I scroll down, the output isn't necessarily that easy to interpret, but you can see it's giving me an error here. The assertion error has failed on this line, as we'd expect, because it was expecting dummy name and it's actually got a lowercase version. So that's a test failing and a test working. So let's fix that back again. Okay, now the test should work again. So that will test the user class. We can do the student class as well. So we now write a test file for the student class. And same thing again, we have a function called test student. Okay, so it needs, we can call it what we like, but it needs to have test underscore at the beginning or test underscore at the end. It gets the capsys, the captured system output passed in. And then we create one of these objects that we're going to test. So in this case, it's student. We give it a dummy name, ID, and, you know, what program they're on. We check that it's stored those values correctly. Then we need to test that it's storing modules correctly. So in our code, the thing that we do to modify the modules is modules is a list. It's the student modules. If you remember, let's go back to the database. So when we create these users, then we do, to add users to modules, we just get hold of the objects modules, which is a list, and we append an item on the end of it. So we can do the same in our test class. Sorry, we do the same here. So we can check that list, the student modules, student.modules, is initially empty. So check that the length is 0. Then we can add something to it, and then we can check that the length is now 1. And then we can check that the 0th element, the element 0, is whatever we added to the list. And so that's checking, as I say, that's checking the setup of the object initially and what happens when we modify the object. So we're checking all of those things. Does it test the student? Well, yes, I think it does, because that's all the code that the student contains. So there are no if blocks, there's no loops or anything. We've just got to check that everything inside here works correctly, and it looks like that's what we're doing here. So we create the dummy student object. We check all the fixed variables, the things that are set up initially, that are passed into that constructor, and then we check that the modules works. So using length and append, we can check that the length is initially 0, and that when we append something to it, that works, and what we appended to it actually ends up in the 0 index position. Okay, and then when you run it, you'll get what we saw. Let's just run that individual one. So if I run this, run PyTest for student 05, you can see that that will test the student class, and it tells us it passed successfully. Or what you can do is you can run all the tests in the folder. So we've got two. We've got student 05 test and the user 05 test. We can run all the tests in there just by right-clicking on that and click Run PyTest in that particular folder. And what that should do is go through that folder, finding all the files that have underscore test at the end or at the beginning. And you can see there it's saying it's tested students successfully, it's tested users successfully. The output is slightly different to this one. This was done on a different machine. I would guess this looks a bit more modern, a bit more up to date. Okay, but the output, if any of them fail, then you'll get an error message. But hopefully you get to the end here where it says 2 passed, and that means we've tested two functions. Okay, so that's some basic tests for just checking data is set up correctly. Let's look at some more in the next video.